Hi everybody, I'm Tim Wagner and welcome to another Writing in the Dark video. This one's all about what is literary horror and is it even a thing? For those of you who don't know me, write science fiction, fantasy, and horror, mostly horror. Also write media tie-ins, published about 50 novels over the years, half original, half media tie-ins. Been teaching creative writing for about 30 years at this point. Reason why I want to talk about this is I saw it on Twitter today. It happens all the time. It's one of these topics that cycle back around, but it's also one of the topics that have come back into the news lately because the new buzzword for it is elevated horror, which you see in a lot of discussions of horror films. To be honest, literary horror, elevated horror, these are terms, at least right now, that are often used by people that only are familiar with horror as horror movies that are meant for entertainment and usually are pretty gory. Not necessarily slasher movies, but it's a shorthand way you can think of it. So the Hollywood types who think horror is only, a Friday the 13th movie, anything that tries to do anything else in terms of story structure, or theme, or character, it's like, oh, look, it's elevated horror. But literary horror really is a thing. The answer is yes. And so let's talk about it and whether or not you may want to write it. So, literary fiction in general is defined as fiction that has more of an artistic intent in terms of like a capital A. It is more about what the writer wants to create and less about them thinking of the audience. It's more I create it and then I put it out into the world and we'll see who likes it. Um, Popular fiction or genre fiction, entertainment-based fiction, written with the reader in mind, on purpose for people to enjoy, on purpose to be accessible. Literary fiction often intellectuals like it because in some ways it's like a puzzle because each work of literary fiction is different. It's a new experience. It's a new experience in terms of the way the story is structured. Entertainment-based fiction, not so much. It's more about the familiar. There's nothing wrong with either approaches. It's just the differences in them. So literary fiction tends to focus on character above all. It tends to focus not at all on plot. Plot is seen as artificial because events in the real world do not happen with a neat beginning, middle, and end. There's a higher sense of the use of language, of the poetry of it, the musicality of it. There's a sense of the inventive, the innovative, of trying to create new narrative structures. For literary writers, the stuff they write may look very different from story to story or novel to novel. It will not be the same thing or the same kind of thing every time. You can't really brand literary writers other than their name. So-and-so literary writer. Literary fiction is very artist focused. It's about what the artist is interested in, what maybe they're obsessed with, what they're trying to explore, see what happens. They're experiments in a lot of ways, every single one of them. And then you just put them out into the world and see if anybody responds. The response is only of importance to them in terms of like, I tried these things. What do you think about these things? They're not worried about entertaining. They're not usually worried about getting a large audience. Certainly not worried about money because money is not their concern. Their concern is primarily artistic. So popular fiction, like I said, it's about the familiar. It tends to be about, it's more reader focused than it is artist focused. It can be about trying to make money. It can be about trying to reach the widest audience possible. It's meant to be entertaining. So it's also meant to be accessible. So the language tends to be plainer. It still can have, poetic flourishes here or there. It can still have a focus on character. It tends to focus on plot more, the story structure. Certainly a lot more than stereotypical literary fiction does. So which of these, is better? Neither is better. They're just different ways of writing stories. Often people get this idea that literary is better because of its artistic focus and aspirations. It tends to be the kind of fiction that's studied in colleges because it's more meaty in the sense of the stuff it has. The experimental stuff, the layers of themes, different kind of use of language, all kinds of things make it interesting to study. That makes it, like I said earlier, kind of a puzzle to figure out. Genre fiction is meant to be enjoyed, and because of this, there's not a lot to study. You can learn from genre fiction, popular fiction, how to create more popular fiction, but you're probably not going to learn anything that contributes overall to the field of fiction, that advances it somehow, that shows new possibilities and new ways of doing things. Now, these kind of like differentiations, the line between literary and popular, there's no real line. It's just like you can have stuff on the extremes, and then everything else from the extremes can be kind of a blur. But when people talk about these different things, that's in general what they're talking. So can genre fiction like horror, science fiction, fantasy, and so on ever be literary? If you went to a college creative writing program or lit program, they'd probably tell you no. And the reason for that is because genre depends on a shared set of tropes, character types, story types, images, story elements, like in science fiction, faster than light drive, sentient robots, alien races, that kind of thing. Readers like these things, readers respond to these things, they come back to these things, but these things lead the creation of a story in a lot of ways. So it's not as artist focused. There's not a lot of room for invention or innovation. There's some room, there's wiggle room. You can do your take on Faster Than Light Drive, or you can do your take on the ghost story. But it's still a ghost story. It's still Faster Than Light Drive. It doesn't arise out of pure originality, at least in terms of what the artist is interested in doing that time. So that's what they would say. Now, I would argue that that's bullshit. It is true that there are some genres that don't lend themselves. Category romance probably could never be considered literary in these definitions, that we're talking about right now, because you have to have certain structures. You have to have a couple that meets, that feels an attraction, that have trouble getting together, that overcome various obstacles, and in the end there is a happy ever after. There's, some variations. You can do a love story that's literary, that's no problem. But a category romance, the way the market defines it in traditional publishing right now, no, you couldn't do that. In mystery fiction, a lot of literary people love mysteries. I had a friend who taught developmental English when I was in grad school, and he'd been doing it for years, and he said mystery was his junk reading, and he meant that as in light and entertaining. He didn't mean that in a disparaging way, because he loved mysteries. I found a lot of academics like mysteries because it's intellectual, it's a puzzle. But there are certain things. There's a crime, there's an investigator, there's a solution at the end, and those things need to be there. So you could take literary approaches to mystery. You can have different elements of mystery that could be literary in the way you approach it, but you're still stuck with a certain number of genre elements that you have to have, at least in the basics in the story structure. Science fiction and horror and fantasy you can do a lot better in terms of literary focus, because you don't necessarily have to have any particular story structure. I mean, they exist, and in particular tropes, they exist, but you're not bound to them the same way you are in mystery, and to a much greater degree in category romance. So yes, you can still, as long as you're trying to do the things that literary fiction does, and you're using some kind of elements that could be considered science fiction, fantasy, or horror, yes, you can have literary science fiction, literary horror, literary fantasy. Like I said, you can still tell a love story, you can tell a crime story. Those things can be very literary, but probably not falling into the traditional category of publishing for those kind of genres. All right, so we'll take a look at my notes here. Example of literary horror writers: Elizabeth Hand, Jennifer McMahon, Nathan Ballingrud, Victor Laval, Brian Evenson, John Langan, Carmen Maria Machado, Paul Tremblay, Stephen Graham Jones, so many. Basically, if you've ever been to a ReaderCon, look and see who the guests are, who are on the panels. Go to ReaderCon's website, check out last year's program and see. Because ReaderCon is the only kind of science fiction, fantasy, horror convention that has a literary focus. The Shirley Jackson Awards, look to see who has been nominated and won. Those are dark fantasy, horror people that write literary fiction, because that's the focus of those awards. So which should you write? If you want to reach the widest audience possible, and this may be, especially if you're an indie writer, entertainment focused fiction. So you're going to write fiction that's probably not literary. It's going to be accessible to the widest audience. It's going to not necessarily cater to them, but appeal to them. A lot of times for indie writers, it's, right to market. What do people want? And, if you're a business and you approach it as a business, you're going to think of it in terms of a product. There's a balance because, of course, it's an artistic product. Otherwise, you go make widgets or whatever and go sell those. It starts with an artistic impulse, but in order to go ahead and sell and make some money, you got to balance that with a business impulse. But if you are interested in, trying to explore for your sake as an artist, your growth as an artist, different ways of doing things. If you're more interested in character than you are plot, if you are interested in having basically an artistic conversation with the people before you, your peers, and maybe the people after you, you would probably write literary fiction. If you don't care how many people read it, but you care that people who read it really get it, and that feeds you, then you probably want to write literary fiction. One of my agents, I've had 3 so far. My second agent used to say, write what burns in your gut, whatever that is, because whatever you feel that strongly about is going to create your very best work, and that very best work will be the most competitive in terms of traditional publishing, but also in terms of indie publishing, just competitive for readers, as opposed to trying to get your, in terms of sales in traditional publishing. Other things you could do, try both. If you're not sure, write a little bit of each. My short stories are a great place for this because you can go ahead and experiment in small ways, big ways, but in a limited kind of way, so that you can try different things out, and you're not like spending the year or 2 writing a literary novel that you decide you hate. But you might also just write the kind of thing you like to read. Don't let somebody tell you literary fiction is more worthy than entertainment-based fiction, or the other way around. Somebody tell you that you need to sell a bunch of copies or else you're not a real writer. It doesn't matter if you have 1 reader or 1 million reader. If you are writing the things that satisfy you, that fulfill you first and foremost. That could be literary fiction in terms of any kind of genre, but I'm talking about horror primarily because that's my thing. It could be entertainment-based. It could be one time and one another time. It does not matter. Your strongest work is what will make your most successful work, whether you define success as money and lots of readers, or you define success as I'm wowing the critics, I'm impressing other writers in my field, I really feel that I am doing something new and innovative, or any combination of them. Just don't get hung up on the whole idea that literary is better, entertainment-based is better. There is no such thing as better. There's only what fulfills you and what fulfills your readers. So if you want to see my take on a trope, trying to do something a little different with it, this is my book, We Will Rise. It's my trying to do something very different with both the apocalypse story and a ghost story. And if you want to learn more about what I think about writing, here's my latest writing book, Writing in the Dark, the Workbook. It's a companion to the Writing in the Dark, has all kinds of exercises in it, and it does discuss things like literary and entertainment-based fiction and how to try to make a decision about that. So thanks a lot. Hope you found this helpful. Like and subscribe, all that good stuff, and hope you join me again next time. Bye now.